I didn't cheat. I didn't even leave. I just prepared, in case. Is it really that bad to plan ahead when you feel a breakup coming? I wrote a few notes. Yes, they were detailed, but I never thought he'd find them. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now, let's get back to the story. I walked into our living room expecting to find David on the couch, watching Netflix like he usually was on Sunday mornings. Instead, he was sitting at our kitchen table with my journal open in front of him, his face completely pale and his hands trembling slightly. My stomach dropped immediately because I knew exactly what he was reading. The journal I kept hidden in my nightstand drawer, the one where I'd been writing what I called my contingency plans for the past 2 months. David looked up when he heard me come in, and the expression on his face was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Not angry, exactly, more like devastated and confused. He asked me what the journal was, his voice barely above a whisper. When I tried to dismiss it as just private thoughts, he explained that it had fallen behind the nightstand when he was making the bed and had been open when he picked it up. Then he started reading from the pages, and I wanted to disappear into the floor. Phase 1. Start moving personal items gradually. Phase 2. Secure my own place before telling him. Phase 3. Plan the conversation for maximum efficiency and minimal drama. Hearing my own words read aloud made them sound so much worse than they'd seemed when I was writing them. I tried to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, that I hadn't been planning to actually break up with him. It was just a coping mechanism, a way to feel prepared in case things went wrong between us. But David kept reading from other pages. My plans for how to handle mutual friends, what to say to make myself look better, how to seem unbothered and successful immediately after a breakup. Step 7. Practice looking happy and confident in public. Step 8. Have a few empowering quotes ready for social media posts. The worst part was when he found the page where I'd written out an actual breakup speech. I'd planned what to say about growth and incompatibility, practiced how to make it sound natural and mature rather than hurtful. David pointed out that I'd written these detailed plans while we were still making vacation plans together, while he was thinking about asking me to move in with him officially. The contrast between his future building and my exit planning was devastating when laid out so starkly. I tried to defend myself by saying that planning for worst-case scenarios was just being practical, that lots of people did it without actually wanting those scenarios to happen. But even as I said it, I could hear how weak it sounded. David told me he needed some air and left the apartment to think. I tried calling and texting him, but he didn't respond. I spent the rest of that day spiraling into guilt and panic, rereading my own journal entries and realizing how cruel and calculated they looked from the outside. The entries I'd thought were smart emotional insurance looked like rehearsed abandonment when seen through David's eyes. I'd been planning our entire breakup like it was a business transaction while he was falling deeper in love with me. Let me explain how I got to the point where I was writing detailed breakup plans while still in a relationship I claim to love. My name is Zoe, and I'm 26 years old. David and I had been together for a year and a half, and for most of that time, I'd been genuinely happy. He was kind and thoughtful and completely devoted to making our relationship work. But about 3 months before David found my journal, I started noticing changes in our dynamic that made me nervous. David had gotten a promotion at work that required longer hours and more travel. He seemed more distracted when we were together, checking his phone more often and seeming tired during our conversations. The compliments that used to come naturally became less frequent. Our text conversations throughout the day became shorter and more practical. When we went out together, David sometimes seemed like his mind was elsewhere. Instead of talking to David about these concerns directly, I started catastrophizing about what they might mean. I convinced myself that he was losing interest in me, that he was probably already thinking about ending our relationship, but hadn't worked up the courage to do it yet. I'd been burned by sudden breakups in the past, relationships that had seemed stable until they suddenly weren't. I'd been blindsided by ex-boyfriends who'd apparently been checking out emotionally long before they'd actually left. So when I started sensing distance from David, my instinct was to protect myself by preparing for the worst-case scenario. I told myself I was being smart and practical, getting ahead of the inevitable instead of being caught off guard. That's when I started keeping the journal with what I called my contingency plans. I wrote down detailed steps for how to handle a potential breakup with minimal emotional damage to myself. I planned how to move my belongings out gradually so David wouldn't notice until it was too late for him to try to change my mind. I wrote scripts for conversations with mutual friends, positioning myself as the one who'd made a mature decision rather than the one who'd been dumped. I even planned what to post on social media after the breakup to control the narrative. I wanted to look empowered and unbothered, like someone who was moving on to bigger and better things, rather than someone who was heartbroken. The journal became a way for me to feel in control of a situation that felt increasingly uncertain. Every time I worried about David's behavior or our future together, I'd add another detail to my breakup plan. It was like emotional insurance. Having an exit strategy made me feel safer in the relationship. I wrote about how to handle the logistics of separating our lives, which mutual friends I thought would take my side, and how to present the breakup as a mutual decision even if David initiated it. I planned responses to questions people might ask and rehearsed ways to seem confident and unaffected. The more detailed my plans became, the more real they started to feel. I began to think of our breakup as inevitable rather than just possible. I started emotionally preparing myself for single life, imagining how I'd redecorate my space and what I'd do with my newfound freedom. But I never actually planned to implement these strategies. In my mind, they were just theoretical preparations, like having a fire escape plan that you hope you'll never need to use. I told myself that writing down my fears and concerns was healthy emotional processing. I convinced myself that being prepared for the worst was just smart self-protection, not a betrayal of my relationship with David. What I didn't consider was how these plans would look to David if he ever found them. I didn't think about how it would feel to discover that your partner had been meticulously planning your breakup while still claiming to love you. To me, the journal represented anxiety management and practical planning. To David, it represented evidence that I'd been emotionally halfway out the door for months while pretending everything was fine. I also didn't realize how my emotional insurance was actually undermining my investment in the relationship. Instead of addressing my concerns about David's behavior directly, I was using my breakup plans as a way to avoid vulnerability and difficult conversations. Rather than risking rejection by asking David about his feelings or expressing my needs in the relationship, I was protecting myself by planning my exit strategy. It felt safer than fighting for what we had together. But safety came at the cost of intimacy and trust. While David was thinking about our future together, I was planning how to leave him efficiently and with minimal drama. When I look back at what I wrote in that journal, I can see how selfish and calculating it was. I wasn't just planning logistics, I was planning how to manipulate the narrative to make myself look good and minimize my own emotional pain. I wrote about posting empowering quotes on social media immediately after the breakup, not because I would actually feel empowered, but because I wanted other people to think I was handling everything well. I planned what to tell our mutual friends to ensure they'd see the breakup from my perspective first. I wanted to control how the story was told, so I wouldn't have to deal with questions or judgment about my role in the relationship ending. I even wrote about how to seem happy and confident in public, practicing facial expressions and body language that would convince people I was doing fine. It was all performance, designed to protect my ego and reputation rather than process my actual feelings. The most damaging part was probably the breakup speech I'd written and practiced. I'd crafted it to sound mature and thoughtful, while actually being designed to make David feel like the breakup was inevitable and probably for the best. I'd written multiple versions of this speech, tweaking the wording to sound as compassionate as possible while still achieving my goal of ending things cleanly. I practiced different tones and approaches, from gentle and sad to confident and forward-looking. In one version, I focused on how we'd grown in different directions and how I needed space to discover who I was outside of a relationship. In another, I emphasized how much I'd learned from our time together while making it clear that I was ready for a new chapter. I planned to focus on vague concepts like growth and different life paths, rather than addressing any specific problems in our relationship. I wanted to end things in a way that would make David feel bad about fighting for us. I even wrote out potential responses to things David might say to try to save our relationship. If he asked what he could do differently, I'd plan to say that it wasn't about him changing, but about me needing something different. If he suggested couples therapy, I'd prepared a speech about how some relationships just run their natural course. The goal was to make him feel like arguing with my decision would be selfish and immature. I wanted him to walk away thinking that I was wise and self-aware for recognizing our incompatibility before things got ugly. Reading those words now, I can see how manipulative and cruel they were. I was planning to break David's heart while making him feel like he should be grateful for my wisdom and maturity. I'd also written detailed plans for the logistics immediately following the breakup conversation. I knew exactly which of my belongings I'd grab that day, which I'd come back for later, and which I'd leave behind to make the process seem less calculated. I'd planned to stay composed during the conversation, maybe shed a single tear to show that I cared but wasn't devastated. I wanted to seem sad but certain, like someone making a difficult but necessary choice rather than someone running away. But at the time, I thought I was being smart and strategic. I thought I was protecting myself from pain and ensuring that I'd come out of the breakup looking good to everyone involved. After David left the apartment that Sunday morning, I spent hours trying to reach him and explain myself. I called and texted repeatedly, but he didn't respond to any of my attempts at communication. The silence was deafening and terrifying. David had never ignored me before, not even during our worst arguments. He was the kind of person who believed in talking things through, no matter how difficult the conversation might be. His lack of response told me everything I needed to know about how deeply I'd hurt him. This wasn't just anger or disappointment. This was the kind of betrayal that made someone question everything they thought they knew about their partner. I tried writing a Notes app apology, explaining that the journal entries didn't represent my true feelings, that I'd just been anxious and needed to write down my fears to process them. But everything I wrote sounded defensive and hollow. How do you apologize for planning someone's emotional destruction? How do you explain that you wrote detailed breakup strategies while claiming to love them? Every explanation I came up with sounded like justification rather than genuine remorse. I deleted and rewrote the apology dozens of times, trying to find words that would adequately express how sorry I was without making excuses for what I'd done. But the truth was that there wasn't really an excuse for the level of detailed planning I'd engaged in. I called my friend Ashley to vent about the situation and get some perspective. But when I explained what had happened, Ashley's response wasn't what I'd expected. She was quiet for a long time after I finished telling her about David finding my journal. When she finally spoke, her voice had a coldness I'd never heard before. Ashley pointed out that I'd essentially been planning David's emotional destruction while sleeping in his bed every night. She said that even if I hadn't intended to hurt him, the level of detail in my planning showed a concerning lack of empathy for how he'd feel. She asked me to really think about what I'd written, not just the practical aspects of moving out and dividing belongings, but the emotional manipulation I'd planned. The scripts designed to make David feel bad for fighting for our relationship, the social media strategy to control public perception of the breakup. Ashley asked me to imagine how I'd react if I found David's journal full of detailed plans for breaking up with me, complete with scripts and social media strategies. The thought made me feel sick, which forced me to confront how David must have felt reading my entries. She pointed out that I'd been treating our relationship like a game I was trying to win, rather than a partnership I was committed to building. My planning hadn't been about protecting myself from hurt. It had been about ensuring I'd come out looking good if things ended. The conversation with Ashley was a wake-up call that I wasn't ready to hear. I'd called her expecting validation and support, but instead she'd held up a mirror that showed me how selfish and manipulative my behavior had been. Other friends I reached out to for support had similar reactions. People who'd previously validated my tendency to plan ahead were now distancing themselves from me, saying that what I'd done crossed a line from self-protection into emotional betrayal. My friend Kate, who'd always been supportive of my analytical approach to relationships, was particularly blunt in her assessment. She said that while she understood wanting to protect yourself emotionally, actually writing detailed breakup plans while in a committed relationship was a form of cheating. Kate pointed out that I'd been living a double life, acting like a loving, committed girlfriend to David's face while secretly planning our demise in private. She said it was the emotional equivalent of having an affair because I'd been investing energy in something that betrayed our relationship. She asked me how I'd been able to look David in the eye while knowing I had pages of detailed plans for leaving him hidden in our bedroom. How I'd been able to accept his love and affection while secretly strategizing about how to minimize the damage when I inevitably hurt him. Even my most understanding friends couldn't rationalize what I'd done. They all seemed to recognize something that I'd been blind to, that my planning had been a form of emotional violence disguised as self-protection. I started to realize that my smart planning had actually been a form of relationship sabotage. Instead of working through my concerns with David, I'd been secretly preparing to abandon him while letting him believe we were building something together. The isolation from my friends forced me to really examine my behavior without the buffer of external validation. I had to confront the possibility that I wasn't the victim of unfortunate circumstances, but the architect of my own relationship's destruction. I spent that week going over every entry in my journal, trying to understand how I'd gotten to such a dark place mentally. What I found was a progression from reasonable anxiety to deliberate emotional detachment. The early entries had been fairly innocent, just general worries about David's work stress and whether it might affect our relationship. But over time, my writing had become more detailed and strategic, less about processing feelings and more about planning tactical maneuvers. I could see the point where I'd stopped trying to save our relationship and started planning its end. I'd stopped writing about my fears and started writing about my exit strategy. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. On Thursday, I got David's final message. It was brief and devastating. He said he deserved someone who wanted to stay, not someone who was constantly preparing to leave. He said he couldn't be in a relationship where his partner was always looking for the exit. The message went on to explain that he'd spent the past few days thinking about our entire relationship through the lens of what he'd discovered in my journal. He said he could now see signs that I'd been emotionally detached for months, that I'd been treating our relationship as temporary even while he was falling deeper in love with me. David wrote that he'd realized I'd never truly been present in our relationship, that I'd always had one foot out the door. He said he couldn't build a future with someone who was constantly planning their escape route. The message ended with David asking me not to contact him anymore. He said he needed to focus on healing from what he described as emotional dishonesty and planning for abandonment. Reading his final message, I could see that David understood exactly what I'd done and why it was so hurtful. He wasn't angry or dramatic, just deeply hurt and determined to protect himself from further damage. I wanted to fight his decision, to convince him that I'd learned from this experience and could be the partner he deserved. But I realized that trying to argue with his boundaries would just prove his point about my selfishness. The urge to respond was overwhelming. I wrote dozens of drafts explaining how sorry I was, how much I'd learned about myself, how different I could be if he gave me another chance. But something stopped me from sending any of them. Maybe it was the recognition that David had been clear about needing space to heal. Maybe it was the realization that pestering him with apologies would be another form of putting my needs above his. Or maybe it was the growing understanding that I needed to respect his decision even if it destroyed me. I spent hours crafting the perfect response that would change his mind, but every attempt felt manipulative and self-serving. I was still trying to control the outcome rather than accepting the consequences of my actions. David was right that he deserved someone who wanted to stay. He deserved someone who would fight for their relationship instead of planning its demise. He deserved someone who would communicate their fears instead of secretly preparing for the worst. I wasn't that person, at least not yet. I'd spent so much energy protecting myself from potential hurt that I'd guaranteed the very abandonment I was trying to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on me that my fear of being left had led me to emotionally leave first. My need to feel in control had cost me the most important relationship I'd ever had. In the weeks that followed, I had to face the reality of actually being single after spending months planning for it theoretically. But instead of feeling empowered and prepared like I'd imagined, I felt devastated and lost. The apartment felt impossibly empty without David's presence. His coffee mug was still in the sink from that last Sunday morning, and I couldn't bring myself to wash it. His books were still on the nightstand, his jacket still hanging by the door. I'd planned for the logistics of him moving out, but I hadn't prepared for the emotional reality of losing him. None of my careful strategizing had accounted for how much I'd miss his laugh, his thoughtfulness, his unwavering belief in our future together. I found myself checking his social media obsessively, looking for signs of how he was handling our breakup. But David had always been private online, and he wasn't posting anything that gave insight into his emotional state. I wanted to see evidence that he was struggling too, that our relationship had meant as much to him as it had to me. But I also hoped he was healing and moving forward, because he deserved happiness even if it couldn't be with me. The worst part was knowing that I had no right to information about his life anymore. I'd forfeited the privilege of knowing how he was doing when I'd chosen to plan our ending instead of fighting for our beginning. None of my careful planning had prepared me for the guilt and regret I felt about losing David. I hadn't anticipated how much I'd miss his presence or how empty my days would feel without him to share them with. I couldn't post empowering quotes on social media because I didn't feel empowered. I felt ashamed and heartbroken and completely responsible for destroying something beautiful. The breakup speech I'd practiced was useless because David had ended things via text, and my planned responses to mutual friends felt hollow because everyone could see that I was the one who'd sabotaged the relationship. My friends' reactions to our breakup confirmed what I already knew, that I was entirely at fault for what had happened. Instead of offering comfort or taking sides, most people seemed to understand that David had made the right decision in protecting himself from me. I realized that my emotional insurance had been a self-fulfilling prophecy. By planning for our relationship to fail, I'd made its failure inevitable. By protecting myself from vulnerability, I'd ensured that I'd end up alone. David had been right to question whether I'd ever really loved him. Looking back, I can see that I'd been more invested in feeling safe than in building something real with him. True love requires vulnerability and commitment, neither of which I'd been willing to offer. I'd kept one foot out the door throughout our entire relationship, always ready to run if things got difficult. Now I'm alone, and the breakup plan came true. But not how I'd imagined it. There was no graceful exit, no empowering narrative, no social media posts about growth and new beginnings. Just silence and regret, and the knowledge that I'd lost the best thing that ever happened to me. It's probably too late for David and me, but maybe I can learn to be the kind of person who deserves lasting love, the kind of person who plans anniversaries instead of exits, who writes love letters instead of breakup speeches.